The morning I discovered my husband had emptied our joint accounts, I was still wearing the silk pajamas he'd given me for our anniversary 2 months earlier. I remember staring at my laptop screen, the banking portal showing a balance of $237.14, where there should have been over $425,000. My coffee went cold beside me as I frantically checked our other accounts, one after another. All empty. 12 years of marriage, our entire financial safety net gone overnight, along with the man who'd sworn to stand by me through better or worse. What Richard didn't realize when he drained those accounts was that I had been my grandmother's favorite for a reason. The woman who grew up during the Great Depression and later became the CFO of a major corporation had taught me her most valuable lesson when I was just 16. Never put all your eggs in one basket, especially if someone else holds the basket. The offshore accounts my husband knew nothing about were about to change everything. Not just for me, but for him too. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It's strange how ordinary the day can seem when your life is about to shatter. That Tuesday morning had started like any other in our Boston suburb home. The early October air had just enough chill to warrant the season's first use of our fireplace the night before. Richard had kissed me goodbye, his aftershave lingering as he headed out for what he said was a 3-day business conference in Chicago. "I'll call you when I land," were his last words to me. I'm Elise Chen, and until that day, I believed I was living a charmed life. At 37, I had a successful career as an investment strategist, a beautiful colonial home in a neighborhood with excellent schools for the children we were still hoping to have, and a husband who colleagues often described as the perfect package, handsome, charismatic, and seemingly devoted. My grandmother Ming had immigrated to America with nothing but her relentless work ethic and uncanny financial instincts. She rose from factory worker to corporate executive over 4 decades, shattering glass ceilings before that term even existed. Her mantra was simple: men will tell you to trust them with your heart and your money. Give them your heart if you must, but always keep control of your money. As a rebellious teenager, I'd rolled my eyes at what I considered her outdated feminism. As an adult woman watching my account balances displaying rows of zeros, I finally understood. I met Richard during a charity gala where my firm was a major sponsor. He worked in commercial real estate development, with the confident swagger of someone accustomed to closing million-dollar deals. Our courtship was a whirlwind of expensive restaurants, weekend getaways, and thoughtful gifts. When he proposed, after 8 months with a diamond that caught the light from every angle, my grandmother was the only person who didn't immediately congratulate me. "He spends a lot for someone at his career stage," she observed quietly as we shared tea the week after my engagement. "Men who need to display wealth often don't actually possess it." I dismissed her concerns as generational paranoia, pointing out Richard's impressive client list and the properties he'd helped develop. She nodded, sipping her tea with the patient expression of someone who knows arguing is pointless. Instead, she made me a proposition. "Consider this my early wedding gift," she said, sliding a folder across her immaculate glass coffee table. Inside was documentation for an investment account in Singapore, seated with $75,000. "This is your personal security, not for your household, not for your future children, not for your husband. Just for you." The strings attached were simple but non-negotiable. I would never mention this account to Richard or include it in our financial discussions. I would make regular small contributions from my personal earnings. And most importantly, I would maintain this financial independence regardless of how strong my marriage seemed. "If you never need it, wonderful. Consider it a separate retirement fund," she shrugged. "But if you do need it someday, you'll need it desperately." To appease her, I agreed, setting up automatic monthly transfers of $500 from my personal checking account to the offshore investment fund. Over the years, that initial $75,000 grew steadily through careful management and compound interest. I occasionally logged in to check the balance, but rarely thought about it. Richard and I maintained what I considered a modern approach to marital finances: a joint household account for shared expenses and mortgage payments, a joint savings account for our future goals, and separate personal accounts for individual spending. The arrangement seemed to work beautifully. We traveled extensively, renovated our home to magazine-worthy perfection, and were discussing starting a family once Richard completed his latest major development project, a luxury condominium complex in downtown Boston that had consumed most of his attention for the past 18 months. There had been signs, of course. There always are in retrospect. The first came about 8 months before that fateful October morning. Richard's normally predictable schedule became erratic. Late-night meetings became commonplace. When he was home, he was constantly on his phone, stepping into another room to take calls. I told myself this was the natural stress of a $60 million development nearing its critical phase. Then came the subtle changes in our finances. Richard suggested consolidating our banking to simplify our financial picture. He proposed moving my personal savings into our joint account for better interest rates. When I hesitated, citing my preference for keeping some money separate, an expression I'd never seen before flashed across his face, something between frustration and calculation, before he quickly smiled and backed off. "Whatever makes you comfortable, honey. I just thought it would be easier to manage everything together." The third sign appeared during a dinner with friends when someone mentioned buying property in the Cayman Islands. Richard became unusually animated, asking detailed questions about banking regulations and residency requirements. Later, he began leaving financial documents face down when I entered his home office, something he'd never done before. But the moment that should have truly alerted me came just 3 weeks before the money disappeared. We were discussing the condominium project over dinner when I asked an innocent question about the project's financing timeline. "Why are you suddenly so interested in the financial details?" he snapped, his tone so sharp that I actually set down my fork in surprise. Almost immediately, his expression softened. "Sorry, it's just been incredibly stressful dealing with investors. They're constantly demanding updates and questioning every decision." He reached for my hand across the table. "Let's not talk about work tonight. Tell me more about that conference. You're speaking at next month." The subject change worked, and I foolishly interpreted his outburst as nothing more than pressure from work. I never pressed him for details about the project's finances again. After discovering our emptied accounts that October morning, my first thought was identity theft. I called our bank's fraud department, only to hear the representative confirm my worst fears. These transactions were authorized using the correct credentials and security questions. They appear to be legitimate transfers to an account registered to. She paused. Richard Chen LLC, established 3 weeks ago. My next call was to Richard. It went straight to voicemail. I texted him, "Emergency. Call me immediately. Money missing from our accounts." No response. I called his office. His assistant Jennifer seemed genuinely confused. "Richard? He's not at a conference in Chicago. He took personal leave for 2 weeks. Said something about a family emergency." Her voice dropped to a concerned whisper. "Is everything okay, Elise?" "Family emergency." The words echoed in my head as I thanked her and hung up. Our only family was each other. His parents had passed years ago, and his relationship with his brother in California was cordial but distant. By noon, with still no word from Richard, the shock began giving way to a cold, clarifying anger. I drove to our bank and sat down with the manager, who pulled up the transaction history. Over the past week, Richard had methodically transferred our money in amounts just under $50,000, likely to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts, into the newly created LLC account. From there, most of it had already moved again to an account in Grand Cayman. "Mrs. Chen, I have to ask. You didn't authorize these transfers?" the manager asked carefully. "No," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "And I'd like to freeze any remaining joint accounts immediately." Next, I went home and began searching for clues. In our shared home office, Richard's filing cabinet drawers hung open, key documents missing. His passport was gone from our fireproof safe, along with the emergency cash we kept there. But he had left something behind, perhaps intentionally overlooked in his haste, or perhaps because he thought I'd never find it. Tucked inside a rarely used reference book was a stack of papers, loan applications, rejection letters, and finally, a notice of default from his project's primary investor, dated 2 months earlier. The luxury condominium development that Richard had described as proceeding on schedule had actually collapsed financially. The investors had pulled out after discovering significant budget mismanagement. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Richard hadn't just failed. Based on the threatening legal language in some of the documents, he appeared to have misappropriated investor funds. He wasn't at a business conference. He wasn't handling a family emergency. My husband had stolen our life savings and fled the country to escape both me and his creditors. As the reality of my situation sank in, I found myself sitting on our bedroom floor, surrounded by the evidence of my husband's betrayal, laughing uncontrollably. Not from humor, but from the absurd cosmic joke of it all. The sophisticated investment strategist who advised wealthy clients on protecting their assets had been completely blindsided in her own marriage. When the inappropriate laughter finally subsided, I did something I hadn't done since my grandmother's funeral 3 years earlier. I wept, deep, body-shaking sobs that left me exhausted and hollow. I allowed myself exactly 1 hour of this collapse. Then I washed my face, changed out of the silk pajamas that now felt like a mockery, and sat down at my computer. I logged into my Singapore account, the one Richard knew nothing about, for the first time in nearly 6 months. The balance displayed made me catch my breath. 837,462. 19. My grandmother's initial gift, combined with my regular contributions and some particularly successful investment choices during the pandemic market volatility, had created a significant safety net. While Richard had stolen our joint savings of $425,000, believing he was leaving me financially devastated, I actually had nearly twice that amount in an account he couldn't touch. As I stared at the screen, I remembered my grandmother's words from years ago. The best revenge against someone who underestimates you is to prove them right, until the exact moment when it matters most that they were wrong. My phone rang, startling me. Unknown number with a Cayman Islands country code. "Hello, Elise." Richard's voice was calm, almost soothing, as if he were calling to check if I wanted him to pick up dinner on his way home. "I'm guessing by now, you've noticed some changes in our accounts." "Changes?" I repeated, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Is that what you call stealing every penny of our savings?" He sighed, the sound so familiar it made my stomach twist. "I know this seems extreme, but I had no choice. The Boston project went sideways. There are people looking for me, people who don't resolve their grievances through lawyers." "So you stole from me instead? Your wife?" "Borrowed," he corrected. "This is temporary. I have a new opportunity here, a development that's practically guaranteed. 6 months, maybe a year, and I'll double what I took. We can start fresh somewhere new." The casual confidence in his voice, the same tone he'd used when convincing me to renovate our kitchen at twice our original budget, made something snap inside me. "There is no we anymore, Richard." "Don't be dramatic, Elise. I know you're upset." "Upset?" I cut him off. "You emptied our accounts, created a shell company to hide the money, lied about where you were going, and fled the country. That's not a rough patch in our marriage. That's criminal. You don't understand the pressure I've been under, he said, his voice hardening. Everything was falling apart. I did what I had to do to survive. And what about my survival? Did you think about that at all when you took every cent we had? There was a pause before he answered, and his response told me everything I needed to know about the man I had married. You'll be fine. You've always been the cautious one with your secure job and perfect credit score. You can rebuild. I need this money more than you do right now. In that moment, I saw our entire relationship with perfect clarity. I had never been a partner to Richard. I had been a resource, a safety net, a respectable front for his increasingly risky financial maneuvers. The realization was both devastating and strangely liberating. I want you to remember this conversation, I said quietly. Remember exactly what you said and how certain you felt saying it. What's that supposed to mean? It means goodbye, Richard. I hung up and blocked his number. Then I opened my laptop again and began creating 3 lists: legal actions, financial recovery, and new beginning. My husband had just taught me the most expensive lesson of my life. But thanks to a grandmother who understood men like Richard far better than I had, it wasn't going to cost me everything. In fact, it was about to become the most expensive mistake he had ever made. I spent that first night alone in our 2-large house, every familiar corner now feeling like a monument to deception. The king-sized bed Richard had insisted on upgrading to last year stretched out beside me, half of it empty and cold. Sleep evaded me as my mind raced through calculations, contingencies, and conversations I would need to have in the coming days. The digital clock on my nightstand blinked 3:17 a.m. when I finally accepted that rest wasn't coming and got up to make coffee. Our kitchen, with its imported Italian marble countertops and professional-grade appliances that Richard had deemed essential during the renovation, now seemed like an obscene display of the facade we'd been living. I ran my fingers along the cool stone surface, remembering how he'd convinced me it was an investment in our future, just one of many decisions, where I'd deferred to his supposed expertise despite the warnings flaring in my own mind. By sunrise, fortified by caffeine and quiet rage, I had formulated a strategy. My years as an investment strategist had taught me to approach problems methodically, to separate emotion from action. I would need both professional assistance and personal support to navigate what lay ahead. My first call was to Meera Patel, a college roommate who had become one of Boston's most respected divorce attorneys. She specialized in high-net-worth separations with complex financial components, exactly what I was facing. I need a consultation as soon as possible, I told her when she picked up, my voice remarkably steady. My husband has emptied our accounts and left the country. To her credit, Meera didn't waste time with platitudes. I can see you at 8:30. Bring any financial documents you can gather, especially recent statements. And Elise, don't touch anything in his office. There may be evidence we need. My next call was to my direct supervisor at the investment firm. Taking a personal day was out of character for me, but necessary under the circumstances. I kept the explanation vague. Unexpected personal emergency, knowing that details would eventually emerge whether I wanted them to or not. After a quick shower and change into what I thought of as my client crisis outfit, a charcoal pencil skirt, and burgundy blazer that projected competence and control, I began the process of documenting our financial situation. I pulled recent statements for all joint accounts, took screenshots of the now empty balances, and gathered the loan rejection letters and default notices I'd found in Richard's office. I also printed the history of transactions showing the methodical emptying of our accounts. Looking at the dates and times laid out chronologically was another blow. He had begun the transfers the day after we'd celebrated our anniversary with an intimate dinner where he'd toasted to many more years of building our future together. Mira's office occupied the 10th floor of a sleek downtown building with views of Boston Harbor. Her assistant ushered me in immediately, and Mira rose from behind her desk, her expression professionally concerned but mercifully free of pity. "Tell me everything," she said after the door closed. "Start with when you first noticed something was wrong." For the next hour, I laid out the situation in detail: the emptied accounts, Richard's flight to the Caymans, the failed development project, our last conversation, and my discovery of his financial troubles. Mira took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just listening with practiced attention. "And what assets remain that he doesn't have access to?" she finally asked. I hesitated for a moment. My grandmother's voice echoed. In my head, "Never reveal all your resources, even to those you're paying for advice." But this wasn't the time for secrecy with my own counsel. "I have a personal investment account in Singapore with approximately $837,000. Richard doesn't know about it. My grandmother established it before our marriage, and I've maintained it separately throughout." Mira's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's fortunate. Many clients in your situation aren't so prepared." She made another note. "Does anyone else know about this account?" "Just the financial advisors who manage it. My grandmother passed away 3 years ago." "Keep it that way. For now." Mira leaned forward. "Elise, based on what you've told me, we're not just dealing with divorce proceedings. Your husband has committed financial fraud and potentially identity theft if he forged your signature on any documents. This crosses into criminal territory." "I'm aware," I said quietly. "There are 2 parallel paths forward. The divorce proceedings, which will include attempting to recover your portion of the marital assets he's taken, and potential criminal charges, which would involve law enforcement. I want both," I said without hesitation. "He needs to understand there are consequences." Mira nodded, seemingly satisfied with my resolve. "We'll file for divorce immediately, citing abandonment and financial misconduct. We'll request emergency orders to freeze any remaining assets and accounts registered in either of your names. Then we'll coordinate with financial crimes investigators regarding the theft and fraud aspects. How much can I realistically recover?" Honestly, recovery from offshore accounts is challenging. The Caymans have banking secrecy laws that make it difficult, though not impossible. But we have one advantage. Your husband doesn't seem to realize you're going to fight back immediately. He probably expects you to spend weeks in emotional distress before taking action. "He's always underestimated me," I said, a small, bitter smile forming. "It's actually his most consistent quality." "Then let's use that." Mira tapped her pen against her notepad. "We need to move quickly while he still believes you're paralyzed by his actions. I'll have papers drawn up today. In the meantime, there are some immediate steps you should take." The list was extensive. Change all my passwords, establish new accounts at a different bank, document and potentially sell valuable items Richard had left behind, change the locks on our home, contact credit bureaus to place fraud alerts, gather evidence of any joint business dealings that might be affected. "What about our house?" I asked. "The mortgage payment is due next week." "Can you make it from your personal funds?" I nodded. "The Singapore account could easily cover our mortgage payments for years if necessary." "Then make it. We'll include those payments in the settlement demands. For now, maintaining the asset is the priority." As I left Mira's office with a thick folder of information and a follow-up appointment scheduled for 2 days later, I felt something I hadn't expected. A growing sense of determination, almost excitement. The path ahead was difficult and unwanted, but I was far from helpless. Richard's betrayal had freed me from the constraints of consideration for his feelings or our shared future. Now I could act solely in my own interest, without the compromise that had gradually eroded my financial instincts over 12 years of marriage. My next stop was a locksmith. By noon, every lock in our home had been changed, the security system, code updated, and new keys were safely in my possession only. The locksmith, a grandfatherly man with kind eyes, didn't ask questions when I explained I needed the work done immediately, but he did offer a gentle piece of advice as he was leaving. "Get yourself a video doorbell too, miss. Records everything. Good for peace of mind." I took his suggestion, ordering one for same-day installation along with additional security cameras for the property. Richard might be in the Caymans, but he had business associates in Boston who might not appreciate his sudden disappearance with investor funds. Better to be cautious. Back home, I called my closest friend, Danielle, who worked as a cybersecurity specialist. I explained the situation as succinctly as possible, focusing on the financial aspects rather than the emotional devastation still simmering beneath my composed exterior. "That absolute bastard," was her immediate response. "I'm coming over, and I'm bringing tools." 2 hours later, Danielle sat cross-legged on my living room floor, her laptop connected to mine, running sophisticated programs I didn't fully understand. "He's definitely been planning this for months," she said, scrolling through recovered browser history and digital footprints Richard hadn't completely erased from our shared home computer. "Look at these searches. Countries with no extradition, treaty, hiding assets in divorce, offshore banking best practices." She shook her head in disgust. "The earliest searches date back almost 7 months." 7 months. While we were discussing starting a family, while he was surprising me with weekend getaways and thoughtful gifts, Richard had been methodically planning his exit strategy. The depth of the deception made me physically ill. "There's something else," Danielle said, her voice softening in a way that made me instantly alert. "Email exchanges with someone named Vanessa. They're personal. Going back about 5 months. I felt a curious numbness as I leaned forward to scan the messages she'd recovered. The correspondence between my husband and this unknown woman was intimate and explicit, filled with plans for their future together, once he had tied up loose ends in Boston. In one particularly painful exchange from just 2 weeks earlier, Richard had promised to bring enough money for them to start fresh without looking back, and described me as a convenient financial safety net he no longer needed. "I'm sorry, Elise," Danielle said quietly. "This is beyond awful." "No," I said after a moment, straightening my shoulders. "It's clarifying. Save everything. It might be useful for the divorce." While Danielle continued her digital forensics, I began the physical inventory of our home. In the master bedroom closet, I noted that Richard had taken only his most expensive suits and watches, leaving behind approximately half his wardrobe. His home office yielded more abandoned files, including a folder labeled Boston Commons Project that contained the complete history of the failed development, names of investors, amounts contributed, correspondence showing increasing concern about mismanagement. The names included several prominent local business figures, people whose reputations and fortunes would have been damaged by their association with a failed project. People who would not appreciate discovering their investment had been misappropriated. I set this folder aside for Mira. It might explain Richard's panic in flight. In our safe, beyond the missing passport and cash, I found a small velvet jewelry box I'd never seen before. Inside was a platinum necklace with a teardrop diamond pendant, clearly expensive, with a small card reading, "For V, until we can be together openly." The gift he'd purchased for his mistress, apparently forgotten in his haste to leave. Another piece of evidence for the divorce proceedings. By evening, Danielle had recovered enough digital information to paint a clear picture. Richard had been planning his escape for months, coordinating with this Vanessa person, researching how to move money undetected, and exploring relocation options in countries with friendly banking laws and difficult extradition processes. He had created the LLC that received our funds using a business associate's address, established the Cayman account through a shell corporation, and systematically erased his digital footprints, though not thoroughly enough to evade Danielle's expertise. "Want me to find this Vanessa person?" she offered as we shared the takeout dinner she'd insisted on ordering. It wouldn't be difficult based on the information here. I considered it for a moment. No, she's irrelevant to my goals right now. Recovering the money and holding Richard legally accountable are my priorities. "Fair enough," Danielle nodded. "But the offer stands if you change your mind." After she left, promising to send me all the recovered files securely, I found myself alone again in the house that no longer felt like home. I wandered from room to room, seeing each space with new eyes. The living room where we'd entertained, his business associates with catered dinners designed to impress, the sun porch where we'd spent Sunday mornings reading together, the guest bedroom we'd planned to convert to a nursery once we started the family. Richard had apparently never actually wanted. In our bedroom, my bedroom now, I began the cathartic process of removing Richard's presence. His remaining clothes went into garbage bags for donation. His toiletries were discarded. The photographs of us together were stored in a box I placed on the highest shelf of the guest room closet, not destroyed, as they might be needed as evidence, but removed from my daily sight. By midnight, physically and emotionally exhausted, I finally lay down in the bed that now felt appropriately sized for one person. Sleep came quickly this time, deep and dreamless, my body demanding recovery even as my mind continued processing the seismic shift in my reality. I woke the next morning to my phone buzzing insistently. Unknown international number, not the same as yesterday's Cayman Islands call. I considered ignoring it, then decided knowledge was power. "Hello? Mrs. Chen?" A male voice, unfamiliar with a British accent. "My name is Malcolm Hargrove. I represent Kingsley Investments. I believe we need to discuss your husband's business activities." Kingsley Investments. The name was familiar. They were the primary backers of Richard's failed condominium project, according to the documents I'd found. "Mr. Hargrove," I replied carefully. "I'm in the process of filing for divorce from Richard Chen, and I've only just discovered his financial misconduct myself. I'm afraid I don't have any information that would help you." "I understand your position, Mrs. Chen. However, we have reason to believe substantial funds from our investment have been diverted to accounts you may have access to. We would prefer to resolve this matter privately before pursuing more formal channels." The implication was clear enough. Kingsley wanted their money, and they thought I might have it, or at least access to it. "Any funds Richard took from your company were taken without my knowledge or consent. In fact, he's also stolen our joint savings of over $425,000 and fled the country. I'm working with authorities regarding these thefts. If you have information about his current whereabouts or financial activities, I suggest you share it with the appropriate legal channels." There was a pause on the line. "I see. And these authorities you've contacted, which agencies specifically?" "I have a meeting with financial crimes investigators this afternoon," I improvised, keeping my voice steady. "My attorney is coordinating with them now. I'd be happy to have her contact you for any information you might want to provide." Another pause. "That won't be necessary at this time. We'll pursue our own avenues of recovery. If your situation changes, or if you hear from your husband, we would appreciate being informed." "Of course," I said, knowing I had no intention of doing any such thing. "May I have your contact information, Mr. Hargrove?" He provided a phone number with a London country code, which I dutifully noted down before ending the call. Immediately, I called Mira. "I've just had a concerning call," I explained, relaying the conversation with Hargrove. "I'm worried that Richard may have taken money from some dangerous people, not just legitimate investors." "I had the same thought when reviewing the documents you provided yesterday," Mira admitted. "Some of these investment structures seem designed to obscure the source of funds. I've expedited our filings and moved up our follow-up meeting. Can you come in at 11 today instead of tomorrow? I'll be there. After a quick breakfast I hardly tasted, I decided to make one more thorough search of Richard's office before meeting Mira. If there was anything else that might help my case, or protect me from Richard's business entanglements, I needed to find it now. The office appeared exactly as I'd left it yesterday, with files neatly stacked on the mahogany desk Richard had insisted was necessary for a successful man's home workspace. I began methodically removing books from the built-in shelves, checking for anything hidden between or behind them. In the business and finance section, a false book spine revealed a hidden compartment containing a thumb drive and a small notebook. The notebook contained what appeared to be account numbers and passwords, some crossed out and rewritten, others circled or starred. The thumb drive was encrypted, but I would have Danielle examine it later. These items went into my bag along with the folder of project documents I'd set aside yesterday. As I replaced the books, my eye caught on something odd, a slight gap in the baseboard beneath the shelves. Kneeling down, I discovered the section was loose. When I pried it away, from the wall, I found a small fireproof document bag tucked into the space behind it. Inside were documents I'd never seen before. A second passport in Richard's name, but with a different birth date, issued by Panama. Ownership papers for a property in Belize under the name Richard Mercer. And most disturbingly, what appeared to be identification documents in the same name, a driver's license, credit cards, even a social security card. My husband had established a complete alternate identity. This wasn't just financial fraud or a hasty escape from debt. This was a calculated, long-term plan to disappear and become someone else. Someone who had never been married to me, who had no connection to failed investments or angry creditors. Someone who could start fresh with his mistress and my money. The discovery sent ice through my veins. Richard was more deliberate, more duplicitous than I'd imagined even in my darkest thoughts yesterday. The man I'd shared my life with for 12 years had been systematically creating an escape hatch, preparing to shed his identity, and me, like an unwanted skin. I photographed every document with my phone before placing everything back in the hidden compartment exactly as I'd found it. If Richard had associates watching the house, I didn't want them knowing I'd discovered his secret identity. Knowledge was leverage, and right now, I needed every advantage I could get. On the drive downtown to Mira's office, my phone rang again. This time, a local number I recognized. Jennifer, Richard's assistant. Elise? I'm so sorry to bother you, but there are people here at the office looking for Richard. They're saying they're investors, but they seem intimidating. I told them he's on personal leave, but they're insisting on contact information. I don't know what to do. Poor Jennifer. She had worked with Richard for 6 years, managing his office with unwavering efficiency and loyalty. She didn't deserve to be caught in this mess. Listen carefully, Jennifer. Don't give them any information about Richard or me. Tell them all business communications need to go through the company's legal department now. Then call building security to escort them out and go home for the day. In fact, take the rest of the week off, paid time. I'll make sure it's covered. But what's happening? Is Richard okay? I hesitated, not wanting to burden her with the ugly truth, but also needing to impress upon her the seriousness of the situation. Richard is dealing with some significant business irregularities. It's being handled through legal channels now. The less you're involved, the better protected. You'll be protected? Her voice rose with alarm. Elise, should I be worried? Just cautious. Don't discuss Richard with anyone who contacts you, and forward any messages or visitors to the legal team. I'll have someone reach out to you next week about next steps. After ending the call, I immediately dialed the number for Richard's company's general counsel, a shrewd older attorney named Howard Green, who had always treated me with genuine respect during company functions. I briefly explained that Richard had left the country under concerning circumstances, that investors were making potentially threatening inquiries, and that I was worried about staff safety. I was afraid something like this might be happening. Howard said, confirming my suspicion that Richard's business troubles weren't entirely unknown within the company. The Boston Commons project has been generating some troubling questions. I'll secure the office and files and make sure Jennifer and the other staff are protected, and Elise. I'm very sorry you're dealing with this. Thank you, Howard. I may need to talk with you further as this unfolds. My door is always open. Richard may have forgotten that business ethics matter, but the rest of us haven't. I arrived at Mira's office feeling like I'd aged a decade in 24 hours. My carefully constructed life had not just been upended, it had been revealed as largely illusory. The successful, charming husband, the thriving development business, the secure financial future, even our plans for a family, all of it built on elaborate deceptions Richard had maintained while creating his escape route. Yet as I sat in Mira's tastefully appointed conference room, surrounded by the emergency divorce filings, financial affidavits, and evidence dossiers we were preparing, I felt an unexpected emotion beneath the hurt and anger. Relief. The constant, small compromises, the deferred dreams, the nagging sense that I wasn't being entirely true to my financial instincts, all of that was over. Richard's betrayal had freed me from a marriage that, in retrospect, had been constraining the woman my grandmother had raised me to be. I placed the photos of Richard's alternate identity documents on the table in front of Mira. There's more to this situation than we thought, I said, and I'm ready to use every piece of it to make sure Richard understands exactly who he's underestimated. The next morning, I discovered two critical pieces of information that changed everything. First, a voice message from an unknown number, a woman with a slight Cayman accent explaining she worked at the Grand Cayman Oceanic Bank and needed to speak with Richard Chen urgently about irregularities with his recent transfers. Second, an email from a detective with the Boston Financial Crimes Unit, responding to the online report Mira had filed on my behalf, requesting an in-person meeting. I listened to the voicemail twice, noting how the bank representative sounded genuinely concerned. Something had flagged Richard's transactions, perhaps the amount, the timing, or some documentation issue. Whatever the reason, it suggested his escape plan wasn't proceeding as smoothly as he'd expected. This was an opportunity. After consulting with Mira, I returned the call, identifying myself as Richard's wife, explaining that he was temporarily unreachable, but that I managed our family finances and could perhaps assist. The representative, Ms. Diane Foster, was initially hesitant, but became more forthcoming when I mentioned my profession in financial services and suggested that any irregularities might indicate fraudulent activity I should be aware of as the potentially affected spouse. Mrs. Chen, there are disclosure limitations I must respect, she began carefully. But I can confirm that the transfers to your husband's recently established account triggered our compliance protocols. We've temporarily restricted access to the funds pending additional verification. I kept my voice neutral despite the surge of hope this news triggered. I understand. My husband traveled quite suddenly for business. Would it be helpful if I provided documentation showing the original source of these funds? For your compliance purposes? That would be most helpful, she confirmed, particularly if you could demonstrate your connection to the originating accounts. Of course. I'll send everything over today. And Ms. Foster, if my husband contacts you directly, would you mind not mentioning our conversation? He's dealing with considerable business stress, and I'd prefer to resolve this administratively without adding to his concerns. After ending the call, I allowed myself exactly 10 seconds of fierce, vindictive triumph. Richard's money was frozen. The carefully orchestrated escape had hit its first major obstacle. While I couldn't access those funds yet, neither could he, and every day those accounts remained frozen meant another day he was stranded without his stolen resources. The meeting with Detective Wilson of the Financial Crimes Unit proved equally productive. A sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor, she reviewed the documentation I provided with meticulous attention. Mrs. Chen, the facts here support several potential charges: wire fraud, identity theft regarding any forged signatures, and potentially embezzlement from both your marital assets and his business investors. She closed her notebook. However, pursuing these charges becomes considerably more complicated with your husband outside the country. I understand that, but I want this officially documented. And I want him to face consequences, even if that means he can never return to the United States without being arrested. Detective Wilson studied me for a moment. Most spouses in your situation focus exclusively on the divorce and financial recovery. Criminal charges complicate those proceedings. I'm not most spouses, I replied evenly. Richard broke our legal and moral contract. He stole from me, from his investors, and apparently created false identity documents. This goes beyond divorce territory. She nodded once, seemingly satisfied with my resolve. Then we'll proceed. I'll need complete access to all financial records, correspondence, and the evidence of the false identity documents you mentioned. We'll coordinate with federal authorities given the international nature of the fraud. As she gathered her notes, Detective Wilson added, "One more thing. Based on what you've shared about these investors, particularly Kingsley Investments, I strongly recommend you continue your current security measures. Some of these entities operate in regulatory gray areas and may employ unconventional collection methods." The detective's warning reinforced my growing suspicion that Richard's business dealings had ventured into dangerous territory. I left the meeting with a heightened sense of urgency and a renewed commitment to untangling myself completely from his web of deception. Back home, I found two unfamiliar men in suits standing on the sidewalk across from our house, watching the property with unconcealed interest. They made no effort to approach or conceal their presence. Their goal was clearly intimidation rather than information gathering. I drove past without slowing, circled the block, and called Mira from a coffee shop parking lot. "There are men watching my house." Her response was immediate. "Go to a hotel tonight. Use a credit card Richard doesn't know about. I'm calling a security consultant I work with for high-profile clients. He'll meet you tomorrow morning." Westbridge Hotel downtown had stringent security protocols and a policy of discretion for all guests. I checked in under my maiden name, Chen being common enough not to immediately connect me to Richard, and requested a room that didn't face the street. Once settled, I turned to the urgent task Ms. Foster from the Cayman Bank had presented: creating a documentation package proving my connection to the stolen funds would serve dual purposes. It would help maintain the freeze on Richard's accounts while establishing my legitimate claim to those assets. I assembled bank statements showing the original balances in our joint accounts, the sequential transfers Richard had made, transaction records bearing both our names as account holders, and our joint tax returns demonstrating the marital nature of the assets. For good measure, I included our marriage certificate and recent utility bills showing both our names at the same address. Anything that would reinforce my legal connection to the funds while satisfying the bank's compliance requirements. I scanned everything, created a secure PDF portfolio, and sent it to Ms. Foster with a professionally worded email thanking her for her diligence in protecting against potential financial crimes. Next, I called Howard Green, the general counsel at Richard's company. "Have there been any unusual visitors at the office today?" I asked without preamble. "As a matter of fact, yes. Two gentlemen with London accents but Eastern European mannerisms. They presented business cards identifying them as representatives of Kingsley Investments. They left when I explained that all investor inquiries were being directed through appropriate legal channels during Richard's absence. Did they seem threatening?" Howard paused. "Not explicitly, but they made a point of mentioning they had considerable resources dedicated to resolving this situation expeditiously. I've implemented security measures for all staff and secured the most sensitive files." Elise, just how deeply was Richard involved with these people? I'm still discovering that myself, I admitted. But I suspect it goes beyond conventional investment relationships. Have you found anything in the company records that might explain the extent of his dealings with them? Nothing conclusive yet. Many of the Kingsley transactions appear to have been handled through Richard's personal channels, rather than standard company protocols. I've launched an internal audit, but it will take time. Please keep me informed. And Howard, be careful. These people may not respect legal boundaries the way we'd expect. After hanging up, I found myself staring out the hotel window at Boston's glittering skyline, the same view I'd enjoyed at countless charity galas and business functions over the years. In those crowded rooms, Richard had always been the magnetic center of attention, his charm and confidence drawing people effortlessly, while I often stood slightly apart, observing more than participating. I had told myself that his social ease complemented my more analytical nature, that we balanced each other perfectly. Now I wondered if that dynamic had been yet another carefully constructed deception, if he had deliberately cultivated my tendency to defer to his judgment in social situations, gradually extending that influence into financial and personal decisions until I'd unconsciously diminished my own instincts and expertise. The realization brought not just anger, but determination. Never again would I surrender my judgment to someone else's confident assertions. Never again would I ignore the warning signals from my own well-trained mind. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown international number. "Elise, I know you're angry, but things are becoming complicated here. I need access to those accounts. Call me. Richard." The desperation underlying his message was palpable. The frozen accounts had clearly derailed whatever plans he'd made with his Vanessa. I didn't respond, instead forwarding the message to Detective Wilson as evidence of his awareness and intent regarding the transferred funds. Later that evening, Danielle called with news about the encrypted thumb drive I'd found in Richard's hidden compartment. "I've accessed part of it," she reported. "Mostly financial records, transaction histories, and correspondence with offshore banking entities. But there's a secured folder I'm still working on that appears to contain communications with someone, using the username Kingsley Prime. The encryption is sophisticated, definitely not something Richard would have set up himself. Can you tell when these communications began? The earliest date stamp is approximately 14 months ago. The frequency increases significantly about 7 months back. The timeline aligned perfectly with Richard's behavioral changes and the beginning of his exit strategy planning. Whatever relationship he'd developed with Kingsley Investments, it had been the catalyst for everything that followed. "There's something else," Danielle continued, hesitation evident in her voice. "I found a document that appears to be a life insurance policy on you, taken out 8 months ago. It's for $3 million, with Richard as the sole beneficiary." The revelation sent a wave of cold fear through me, unlike anything I'd experienced since this nightmare began. A life insurance policy I'd never approved or signed? The implications were too disturbing to ignore. "Send everything to Detective Wilson immediately. And Danielle, don't tell anyone else about this. Not yet." Sleep eluded me that night, my mind racing through increasingly alarming scenarios. Had Richard considered an even darker exit strategy than abandonment and theft? The insurance policy suggested possibilities I could barely bring myself to contemplate. For the first time, I felt genuinely afraid, not just of financial ruin or public humiliation, but for my physical safety. The security consultant Mira had arranged met me in the hotel's restaurant the next morning. A former military intelligence officer named James Landon, who now specialized in personal security for high-net-worth clients in complex situations. "Your house isn't secure enough," he stated bluntly after I'd briefed him on the situation. "Too many access points, insufficient surveillance, coverage, and too well known to Richard's associates. You need a temporary residence with controlled access points while this situation resolves." "I have an apartment in Cambridge under my maiden name," I revealed. A pied-à-terre I purchased before meeting Richard. He doesn't know about it. James raised an eyebrow, clearly reassessing me. That's good. Very good. We'll secure it. Properly, install additional surveillance and establish protocols for your movements. Does anyone else know about this property? Just my grandmother, who's deceased, and the property management company. I've maintained it as a rental unit for years, keeping it vacant between tenants for personal use when needed. Perfect. We'll move you there today. I'll need full details on Richard's known associates, particularly anyone with military or law enforcement background who might have specialized skills. I provided everything I could recall about Richard's business connections, friends, and the names I'd discovered in his files. James listened attentively, occasionally making notes in a small pad. One last question, he said as we concluded. How far are you willing to go to protect yourself? What do you mean? Some clients want security that remains invisible and non-confrontational. Others prefer a more assertive approach that sends a clear message to potential threats. I considered the question carefully. I want to be safe, but I also need to be able to continue my professional life and eventual return to normalcy. However, I won't hesitate to press charges against anyone who threatens me, regardless of their connection to Richard. James nodded, seemingly satisfied. We'll proceed with comprehensive but discreet measures. You'll have constant monitoring without obvious security presence unless a situation escalates. The move to my Cambridge apartment that afternoon marked another step in reclaiming my independence. The modest two-bedroom space, with its simple furnishings and uncluttered aesthetic, felt more authentically mine than the grand house in the sea. Suburbs ever had. Richard had never set foot here. His influence hadn't shaped a single choice in this space. For the first time in days, I could breathe without feeling surrounded by lies. James and his team installed additional security measures, upgraded locks, window sensors, cameras with remote monitoring, and a direct alert system to both his team and local police. They established protocols for my daily movements and communications, emphasizing unpredictability in routines and careful attention to my surroundings. We've identified the men watching your house, James informed me as his team completed their work. Former military contractors now working for a private security firm with known connections to several investment groups, including entities associated with Kingsley. They're professionals, not thugs, which is both good and bad news. How so? They're unlikely to resort to crude intimidation tactics or violence without clear authorization. But they're also highly effective at surveillance and information gathering. They know what they're doing. What's their objective? Based on their patterns, primarily tracking your movements and communications, likely attempting to determine where the money is and whether you have access to it. They're watching, not acting. Yet. The qualification in his final word hung in the air between us. We'll counter-monitor them, James continued. Know their movements before they know yours. Just maintain your vigilance and follow our protocols. That evening, alone in my apartment with its new security features providing a measure of reassurance, I focused on the next phase of my strategy. Richard's accounts remained frozen in the Caymans, buying precious time. But I needed to shift, from defensive measures to offensive action. I called Mira for an update on our legal proceedings. The emergency orders have been granted, she reported. Any assets in Richard's name or joint holdings within U.S. jurisdiction are now frozen, pending divorce proceedings. We've also filed notices with credit bureaus preventing new accounts or loans using your social security number or joint credit history. What about recovery of the transferred funds? We've initiated proceedings through international channels, but honestly, Elise, that's a longer process with uncertain outcomes. The freeze on his Cayman accounts is our best leverage right now. If he can't access those funds, he may become desperate enough to negotiate. And if he doesn't? Mira's voice softened slightly. Then we proceed with divorce on grounds of abandonment and financial misconduct. We seek maximum financial penalties. and recovery through domestic assets we can reach. And the criminal charges proceed independently. So essentially, we make his return to normal life in the States impossible without facing legal consequences. Exactly. He's built a prison of his own making. It's just not one with physical bars. After our call, I turned to the one task I'd been avoiding, contacting my parents. They lived in San Francisco, where my father continued his medical practice, well past typical retirement age, and my mother divided her time between community board service and doting on my sister's children. They had always liked Richard, impressed by his charm and apparent business success. This conversation would be painful for all of us. I waited until I knew they'd be home after dinner, then made the call, putting it on speaker so I could pace the apartment as we talked. "Elise, what a lovely surprise," my mother answered warmly. "We were just talking about you two yesterday. Dad's conference next month is in Boston, and we were hoping to extend the trip to visit you and Richard." The familiar guilt of inadequate communication with my parents twisted inside me. "Mom, is Dad there too? I need to talk to both of you about something important." Her tone immediately shifted to concern. "Of course, dear. Let me get him." After a brief shuffle, my father's voice joined the call. "Elise, what's happening? You never call on a weeknight." Taking a deep breath, I laid out the situation as succinctly as possible. Richard's disappearance, the stolen funds, the evidence of long-term deception, and the measures I was taking to protect myself both legally and physically. I spared them. The details about the life insurance policy and the potentially dangerous investors, focusing instead on the financial fraud and imminent divorce. The silence after I finished was deafening, until my father broke it with a single, forceful expletive I'd never heard him use before. "I'm coming to Boston," my mother declared, her voice tight with controlled fury. "You shouldn't be alone dealing with this." "Mom, I'm not alone. I have excellent legal representation, security measures in place, and support from friends. More importantly, I need to handle this myself. This is my life to rebuild." "But..." "Please," I interrupted gently. "The best support you can give me is respecting that I'm capable of managing this crisis. I'll keep you updated on everything, and I welcome your advice. But I need to stand on my own through this process." My father's voice, calmer now but underlined with steel, rejoined the conversation. "Your mother and I will respect your wishes. Elise, but understand this. If at any point you need us, we're on the first plane to Boston. No discussion necessary." "I know, Dad, and I love you both for that." After promises of daily updates and reluctant agreements not to share the situation with extended family yet, we ended the call. I felt simultaneously drained and strengthened by the conversation. My parents' immediate protective instinct was touching, but their ultimate respect for my autonomy was the greater gift. The next morning brought a surprising email from Ms. Foster at the Cayman Bank. Subject line: Account. Status update confidential. Mrs. Chen, following review of the documentation you provided and our internal compliance procedures, the bank has determined that the recent transfers to your husband's account demonstrate concerning irregularities. As a result, we are extending the temporary restriction on withdrawals pending potential regulatory review. Additionally, as a named party on the originating accounts, you may wish to consult with legal counsel regarding your rights to dispute these transactions through appropriate banking channels. Reading between the carefully worded lines, Ms. Foster was essentially telling me that their investigation supported my fraud claims and suggesting a path toward potentially recovering the funds. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was the first truly promising development regarding the stolen money. I forwarded the email to Mira with a brief note. "Opportunity here?" Her response came within minutes. "Absolutely. This is the opening we needed. I'll have International Banking Council draft the formal dispute immediately." Later that morning, I returned to my office at the investment firm for the first time since discovering Richard's betrayal. My colleagues were professionally discreet, though I noticed the concerned glances and hushed conversations that ceased when I approached. Rumors clearly had begun circulating, though whether about Richard's business troubles or our marital situation remained unclear. My direct supervisor, Eleanor, called me into her office midday. A formidable woman in her late 50s who had broken numerous glass ceilings in financial services, she had been both mentor and advocate throughout my career. She closed the door and got straight to the point. The firm has been contacted by investigators regarding Richard's business activities. Ordinarily, this would trigger our compliance protocols concerning potential conflicts of interest with your client portfolio. However, I understand you're in the process of legal separation. Divorce, I corrected firmly. On grounds of abandonment and financial misconduct. I've had no involvement or knowledge of Richard's questionable business dealings, and I'm cooperating fully with authorities. Eleanor nodded, seeming unsurprised. I never thought otherwise. Nevertheless, we need to address the situation formally to protect both you and the firm. I'm proposing a temporary recusal from any clients with potential connections to Richard's development projects or investment partners, with full retention of your other accounts and compensation structure. The arrangement was more than fair. It was generous, preserving my professional standing while acknowledging the complex realities of my personal situation. Thank you, Eleanor. I appreciate the firm's support during this unexpected transition. We value your work, Elise. And speaking personally rather than as your supervisor, if you need additional flexibility or resources during this time, just ask. I've seen enough in this industry to know that successful men sometimes build their empires on very questionable foundations. Her understanding meant more than she could know. My career had always been my own achievement, separate from Richard's influence, and maintaining that professional identity was crucial to rebuilding my life. As I left Eleanor's office, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Smart. Move freezing the Cayman accounts. But there are others you don't know about. This isn't over. Richard isn't the only one you've inconvenienced. I showed the message to James immediately, who photographed it and added it to his security file. This changes the assessment, he said gravely. This isn't just about Richard or even the known investors. Someone else is involved in making direct contact. We need to escalate security measures. That night, as I worked late in my secured apartment reviewing client portfolios, I realized something had fundamentally shifted within me. The initial shock and betrayal had transformed into a cold, focused determination, unlike anything I'd experienced before. Richard had intended to leave me financially and emotionally devastated, a helpless victim of his calculated exit strategy. Instead, he had inadvertently awakened something more formidable than he could have anticipated. A woman fully reclaiming her power, expertise, and independence. A woman no longer constrained by the subtle accommodations and compromises that had gradually diminished her over 12 years of marriage. The offshore fortune my grandmother had insisted I maintain wasn't just financial security, it was the foundation for my complete reinvention. Richard had underestimated me for the last time, and whoever had sent that threatening text was about to learn the same lesson. The threatening text message marked a turning point in my approach to the entire situation. Until that moment, I'd been focused on defensive measures, protecting myself, documenting Richard's fraud, and working through proper legal channels. But someone unknown had just directly threatened me, suggesting that Richard wasn't working. A loan and that additional hidden accounts existed. This nameless entity considered me an inconvenience to be dealt with. The implied menace demanded a strategic shift. We need to identify who sent this, I told James during our morning security briefing in my Cambridge apartment. This isn't Richard's style. He prefers charm and misdirection, not direct threats. James nodded, studying the message once more. The phrasing suggests someone with financial interests beyond Richard's personal situation. Inconvenienced is an interesting word choice. Professional, almost corporate. Kingsley Investments, I suggested, recalling the ominous men who had approached Howard at Richard's company and watched my house. Possibly. Or another party entirely that Richard became entangled with. Either way, this changes our security profile. I'm adding a second team for surveillance countermeasures and personal protection. While James implemented enhanced security protocols, I scheduled an urgent meeting with Detective Wilson to share the new threat. Her response was immediate and concerning. "This escalates the situation beyond financial fraud," she said, photographing the message for evidence. "We're looking at potential criminal intimidation now. I'm bringing in our organized financial crimes division. There are patterns here consistent with certain investment groups that operate across regulatory boundaries." "You've seen this type of situation before?" Detective Wilson's expression was grim. "More often than you'd think. Legitimate-appearing investment firms with connections to less legitimate capital sources. When significant sums disappear, these entities tend to pursue recovery through irregular channels." "Are you saying Richard may have been involved with criminal organizations?" "I'm saying the line between aggressive international investment groups and organized crime can be remarkably thin, especially when dealing with development projects that require large capital infusions with minimal oversight. Your husband may have crossed that line, wittingly or unwittingly." This revelation added a disturbing new dimension to Richard's betrayal. Had he knowingly involved himself with criminal elements? Or had he been so desperate to maintain his facade of success that he'd accepted funding without questioning its sources? Either possibility painted a more dangerous picture than I'd initially imagined. "What's my next step?" I asked the detective. "Continue documenting everything. Maintain your security measures, and prepare for the possibility that this may escalate further before it resolves." She handed me her card with a personal cell number handwritten on the back. "Call this number directly if you receive any additional threats or observe suspicious activity, day or night." As I left the police station, I noticed a black sedan with tinted windows parked across the street, its engine running. The driver made no attempt to follow as I departed, but the vehicle's presence, deliberately visible and stationary, conveyed its intended message. "We're watching." Rather than returning directly to my apartment, I implemented one of the evasion protocols James had taught me, taking an indirect route with multiple transportation changes to ensure I wasn't followed. Once certain of my privacy, I called Mira from a coffee shop several miles from my usual locations. "The situation has escalated," I explained, keeping my voice low. "I've received threats suggesting involvement from parties beyond Richard, possibly connected to illegal funding sources." Mira's concern was evident. "This complicates our approach. We need to consider whether pursuing the offshore funds might provoke more serious responses from these entities." "I'm not backing down," I said firmly, "but I am adjusting my strategy. I need to understand exactly who Richard was involved with and what happened to all the money. Not just our personal funds, but the investment capital for his projects. That goes beyond normal divorce proceedings, Elise. You're talking about investigating potential criminal financial networks." "I know, but I can't protect myself effectively without understanding who's threatening me and why they're so concerned about my actions. There must be more at stake than just our marital assets." After ending the call with Mira, I made a decision that would irrevocably alter my approach to the entire situation. If criminal entities were involved, working exclusively through conventional, legal channels might prove inadequate, both for recovering the stolen funds and for ensuring my personal safety. I needed additional leverage and information from sources with relevant expertise. I had avoided contacting my firm's high-net-worth client Victor Kwan until now, not wanting to mix professional relationships with personal crises. But Victor's background before becoming a successful tech entrepreneur included specialized cybersecurity work for financial intelligence units. His knowledge of international financial tracking systems and the shadowy intersections of legitimate banking and gray market transactions was exactly what I needed. I called his private number, which he had provided for investment emergencies only. "Elise, is there a problem with my portfolio?" He answered immediately. "No, Victor. I'm calling about a personal matter where your particular expertise might be invaluable. I need advice on tracing funds through offshore structures potentially connected to irregular investment sources." A brief silence. That sounds significantly outside typical investment management concerns. It is. That's why I'm calling from a secure location using a prepaid phone. I wouldn't ask if the situation weren't extraordinary. Another pause. "Meet me at Autonomous Systems. Use the service entrance on Palmer Street. 1 hour." Autonomous Systems was Victor's tech company, housed in a nondescript building near Kendall Square. The service entrance led to a security checkpoint where I was escorted to a conference room with unusual features. No windows, signal-blocking material visibly lining the walls, and a sophisticated white noise generator humming softly in the corner. Victor entered alone, closing the door with deliberate care. At 52, he maintained the focused intensity that had made him successful across multiple ventures. His expression was cautious, but not unfriendly. "Before we begin, I need to understand something," he said, remaining standing. "Are you approaching me as my investment advisor under some obscure compliance requirement? Or as someone seeking assistance with a personal matter outside your professional capacity?" "The latter. What I'm about to share has no connection to your investments or my firm. I'm here because I need help from someone with your particular background, and because I trust your discretion." He nodded once, seemingly satisfied, and finally took a seat across from me. "Then tell me what's happening." I provided a concise summary of the situation: Richard's disappearance, the stolen funds, the failed development project, the frozen Cayman accounts, and most significantly, the threats suggesting involvement from entities beyond Richard himself. Victor listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly concerned. When I finished, he remained silent for several long moments, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Your husband has created an extraordinarily dangerous situation," he finally said. "Based on what you've described, particularly regarding Kingsley Investments, I believe he's become entangled with a specific type of financial entity, one that provides capital for development projects when conventional funding sources refuse, but expects substantial returns and employs unconventional collection methods when transactions go awry." "You're familiar with them?" "Not Kingsley specifically, but organizations with similar operational patterns. They typically maintain legitimate-appearing front operations while functioning essentially as sophisticated money laundering vehicles for less legitimate capital sources. Their investment targets, often real estate development projects, provide perfect mechanisms for cleaning substantial sums while generating acceptable returns." "And when those projects fail?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. "They don't accept failure as an outcome. The capital must be recovered, regardless of the project's actual performance. Your husband likely discovered this when his development faced problems and tried to use your joint assets to temporarily cover the shortfall, perhaps intending to replace it later. But instead, he ran." Victor nodded grimly. "Taking what? Funds he could access in the process. From their perspective, he's stolen their money, not just failed in business. That's a critical distinction. So these threats are entirely credible. These entities view financial obligations as absolutely binding. They may hold you responsible as Richard's spouse, particularly if any of your joint assets were used, as collateral or guarantee for their investments." The implications were chilling. Richard hadn't just betrayed me personally. He'd potentially made me a target for criminal organizations seeking to recover their investments. "What can I do?" I asked. Victor considered for a moment. Several things, none without risk. First, distance yourself publicly and legally from Richard's business activities through immediate divorce proceedings and formal financial separation, which you've already initiated. Second, gather comprehensive documentation of all transactions between Richard's business entities and these investment groups, establishing your non-involvement. Third, he paused, seemingly weighing his next words carefully. Third, consider a more proactive approach to understanding exactly what happened to their money. If you can identify where the missing investment funds actually went, beyond your personal accounts Richard drained, you create potential leverage. Information about their financial movements has value, both as protection and as a negotiating tool. How would I even begin tracing those movements? Victor's expression shifted subtly. That's where I could provide assistance, utilizing methods and resources outside conventional banking channels. But Elise, this path carries significant legal and personal risks. You would be inserting yourself into a situation most people would run from. I'm already in this situation whether I chose it or not, I replied. Running hasn't helped Richard. I prefer to understand what I'm facing. After another long moment of assessment, Victor seemed to reach a decision. I'll help you trace the money flows. Not as your client, but as, let's call it a professional courtesy between individuals with mutual interests in financial intelligence. In return, I ask only that you maintain absolute confidentiality about my involvement and follow my security protocols without exception. Agreed. Then we'll begin immediately. I'll need detailed information about Richard's business structure, known financial accounts, development projects, and any communications regarding his investment relationships. For the next 2 hours, we worked through everything I knew about Richard's business activities, creating a comprehensive map of his financial connections and transactions. Victor occasionally made calls to unnamed associates, speaking in technical terminology that suggested specialized knowledge of banking systems and their vulnerabilities. By early evening, Victor had established a secure communication channel between us and outlined the investigative process his team would undertake. We should have preliminary results within 48 hours. Until then, maintain your security measures and avoid any direct engagement with Richard or representatives from these investment groups. As I prepared to leave, Victor offered one final piece of advice. Your grandmother was wise to insist on your financial independence. But now you need more than financial separation. You need informational leverage. In situations like this, knowing where the bodies are buried, so to speak, can be more valuable than money itself. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. That evening, back in my secured apartment, I received another call from Ms. Foster at the Cayman Bank. Her voice carried an urgent undercurrent I hadn't heard in our previous conversations. Mrs. Chen, I need to alert you to a development regarding the accounts we discussed. We've received persistent inquiries from multiple parties claiming authorization to access these funds, including legal representatives presenting powers of attorney with your purported signature. My signature? That's impossible. I haven't signed any such documents. That was our assessment as well, which is why I'm contacting you directly. The documentation appears sophisticated but doesn't match your signature examples in our records. More concerning, some of these representatives have been unusually insistent in their approach to our staff. Threatening your bank employees? Not explicitly, but employing pressure tactics outside normal banking protocols. Mrs. Chen, while I cannot advise you personally, I believe you should be aware that these accounts have become the focus of extraordinary attention from multiple parties. Thank you for the warning, Ms. Foster. Please continue maintaining the freeze on these accounts pending the formal disputes we've filed. After ending the call, I immediately contacted James to update him on this new development. His response was swift and decisive. We're moving you tonight. The apartment may be compromised if they're escalating to forgery attempts. I have a secure location prepared with more robust protective measures. Within an hour, I had packed, essential items, and was being transported in an unmarked vehicle to a high-security apartment building in a different part of the city. The unit belonged to one of James's corporate clients and featured advanced security systems, private elevator access, and 24-hour monitoring. "This location isn't connected to you in any way," James explained as we entered the spacious but sparsely furnished apartment. "The building requires biometric verification for access, employs former Special Forces personnel for security, and maintains protocols designed for executives with active threats. You'll be significantly safer here." As I settled into the impersonal space that would be my home for the foreseeable future, I was struck by how dramatically my life had transformed in less than 2 weeks. From a seemingly successful marriage in our beautiful suburban home to living in a secured safe house under threat from criminal financial entities, all because Richard couldn't face the consequences of his business failures. The next morning brought an unexpected communication, an email from Richard himself, sent to my work address from an unfamiliar account. "Elise, I know you're angry and hurt, but you need to stop whatever you're doing with the Cayman accounts. You don't understand the relationships involved or the consequences of interfering. These are dangerous people who don't recognize normal legal boundaries. Transfer all dispute claims and grant me access to the accounts immediately. This is about survival now, not money, for both of us." The message confirmed what Victor and Detective Wilson had suggested. Richard was trapped between criminal, investors, and his own desperation. His concern wasn't for my well-being, but for his ability to access the stolen funds to appease these entities. I forwarded the email to Detective Wilson without responding to Richard. Later that day, I received the preliminary findings from Victor's investigation, delivered via the secure communication channel we'd established. The information was more disturbing than I'd anticipated. Richard's development company had indeed received substantial funding from Kingsley Investments, approximately $28 million for the Boston Commons project. However, only about $17 million had actually been directed toward legitimate development expenses. The remaining $11 million had been systematically diverted through a complex series of shell companies and offshore accounts over the preceding 18 months. More alarmingly, Kingsley itself appeared to be primarily a front organization for capital from sources in Eastern Europe, with known connections to organized crime. The investment structure had been designed specifically to obscure the original funding sources while creating the appearance of legitimate international investment. Victor's analysis concluded with a disturbing assessment. Based on transaction patterns and financial flows, Richard Chen appears to have been deliberately misappropriating funds from what amounts to a sophisticated money laundering operation, likely believing the complexity of the structure would prevent detection. His recent actions suggest he recognized the inevitable discovery of these diversions and attempted to escape with whatever assets he could liquidate quickly. In essence, Richard hadn't just failed at a legitimate business venture, he'd been stealing from organized crime for over a year, using our marital assets as his escape fund when the scheme began to collapse. The $425,000 he'd taken from our accounts was insignificant compared to the $11 million missing from the criminal investment structure. This revelation explained the intensity of the pursuit and the escalating threats. The entities behind Kingsley weren't merely seeking to recover a failed investment. They were hunting someone who had deliberately stolen from them over an extended period. I immediately shared this information with Detective Wilson, who responded by elevating the case to a joint task force including the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Within hours, I was sitting in a secure conference room at the federal building, briefing investigators on everything I'd learned. "Based on this new information, we're reclassifying your situation," the FBI agent explained. "This goes beyond divorce proceedings or simple financial fraud. Your husband has essentially made himself, and potentially you by association, targets of an international criminal organization specializing in financial crimes with known tendencies toward violent enforcement." "What does that mean for me? Practically?" I asked. We're offering you formal protection through our witness security protocols while we investigate these organizations. This would involve temporary relocation and identity measures. The offer was simultaneously reassuring and terrifying, confirmation that the threat was significant enough to warrant federal protection, but also that my life as I knew it would be further disrupted indefinitely. "I need time to consider this," I said. "I have professional responsibilities and ongoing legal proceedings that require my presence. We understand, but I strongly urge you to accept our protection. These organizations have demonstrated consistent patterns of eliminating witnesses and obstacles through whatever means necessary." I left the meeting with a direct line to the task force and instructions to notify them immediately of any new threats or contact attempts. The weight of the situation pressed down on me as I returned to the safe house, where James waited with news of his own. "We've identified surveillance teams watching your office building and your attorney's offices," he reported. "Professional operations, multiple personnel with tactical training. They're establishing a comprehensive monitoring network around your known locations and associates. They're mapping my movements and connections," I said, understanding the strategy. "Exactly. Standard procedure for this type of operation. Identify patterns, relationships, and potential leverage points before making direct contact." That evening, as I processed these escalating developments, my secure phone received a text from Victor. "Additional findings require immediate discussion. Palmer Street entrance, 10 p.m. Following stringent security protocols, I arrived at Autonomous Systems through a carefully plotted route designed to detect and evade surveillance. Victor met me personally at the service entrance, his expression more serious than during our previous meeting. "We've uncovered something unexpected," he said once we were inside the secure conference room. "The pattern of diverted funds from the Kingsley investment doesn't match typical embezzlement for personal gain. Approximately $7 million of the missing $11 million was transferred through multiple intermediaries to accounts associated with regulatory agencies and political figures connected to development approvals." "Are you saying Richard was using the money for bribes?" "Essentially, yes, but on a scale and with a sophistication that suggests this wasn't his first such operation. The transaction structures mirror established patterns used by certain development conglomerates to facilitate project approvals in challenging regulatory environments." Victor activated a wall screen displaying a complex web of financial transfers, shell companies, and recipient entities. "This represents just the Boston Commons project, but we've identified markers suggesting similar patterns in at least 3 other development projects Richard managed over the past 5 years." The implications were staggering. Richard hadn't just been stealing for personal enrichment. He'd been operating a systematic bribery scheme using funds from increasingly questionable sources. What had begun as desperate attempts to save failing projects had apparently evolved into a deliberate criminal enterprise. "There's more," Victor continued. "We've identified communications suggesting Richard was preparing to provide evidence about these financial structures to federal authorities before his sudden departure. It appears he may have been attempting to negotiate some form of immunity arrangement. He was going to turn informant against these investors? The communications are incomplete, but they indicate preliminary discussions with individuals connected to federal financial crimes units. Nothing was finalized before he emptied your accounts and fled." This new information cast Richard's actions in yet another light. Perhaps his escape wasn't just about avoiding the consequences of business failure or even theft. It might have been precipitated by fear that his potential cooperation with authorities had been discovered by the criminal organizations involved. "If these entities learned he was speaking to federal authorities," I began. "His life expectancy would be measured in days," Victor finished grimly. "And anyone associated with him would be considered a potential liability." The full picture was finally emerging. Richard had built his development business on systematic corruption, eventually turning to criminal funding sources when legitimate options disappeared. When those projects began failing, he diverted funds to maintain appearances. Then, perhaps recognizing the inevitable collapse and the dangerous entities he'd become entangled with, he attempted to negotiate protection from authorities. When that strategy became compromised, he fled with whatever assets he could quickly access. And now I was left dealing with the consequences of his actions, potentially targeted by criminal organizations who might view me as either an asset to leverage against Richard or a liability to eliminate. As I contemplated this disturbing reality, Victor made an unexpected suggestion. There may be an opportunity here, dangerous, but potentially effective. These organizations prioritize their financial interests above all else. If you could demonstrate control over information that threatens their operations more broadly than Richard's actions alone, you might negotiate a resolution that ensures your safety. You're suggesting I blackmail an international criminal organization? I'm suggesting you establish a position of mutual interest rather than remaining a perceived obstacle. These entities operate on cold financial calculations. If protecting you becomes more financially prudent than pursuing you, they'll adjust accordingly. The strategy was audacious and frightening, but it offered a potential path forward that didn't involve indefinite witness protection or living in perpetual fear. If I could leverage the information Victor had uncovered about the broader bribery and money laundering operations, I might negotiate my way out of the dangerous situation Richard had created. As I left Autonomous Systems that night, the weight of these revelations and possibilities pressed down on me. The woman who had once been Mrs. Richard Chen, supportive wife, successful investment advisor, and aspiring mother, was gone forever. In her place stood someone harder, more calculating, forced by circumstance to consider strategies she would have found unthinkable just weeks before. My offshore fortune, the financial independence my grandmother had insisted upon, had provided the foundation for my resistance against Richard's betrayal. But surviving the deadly aftermath of his criminal entanglements would require more than money. It would demand a fundamental transformation of who I was and how I engaged with a world far darker than I had ever imagined existing alongside my orderly financial expertise. That night, in the anonymous security of my safe house, I made a decision that would define everything that followed. I would not be a victim, not of Richard's betrayal, not of criminal threats, not of circumstances beyond my control. I would use every resource, every connection, and every piece of information to reclaim not just my financial security, but my right to live without fear. Tomorrow, I would begin constructing my countermove against the forces Richard had set in motion. The offshore fortune he hadn't known about was just the beginning of what he, and those pursuing him, had failed to anticipate about the woman they had so severely underestimated. The morning dawned crisp and clear, a beautiful autumn day that seemed mockingly at odds with the dangerous reality of my situation. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the safe house, watching Boston come alive below, feeling oddly detached from the normal rhythms of the city continuing without me. Somewhere out there, people were pursuing ordinary lives, commuting to work, getting coffee, worrying about mundane problems, while I contemplated negotiating with criminal organizations to reclaim my safety. James arrived at precisely 7 a.m., carrying a secure laptop and several encrypted drives. The surveillance teams expanded overnight, he reported without preamble. They've added your parents' home in San Francisco to their monitoring network. Started yesterday evening, professional, 2-person team. The news sent a chill through me. They're identifying leverage points. Exactly. Family members are typically high-value targets for pressure. I've arranged for a private security detail to monitor your parents, but we should consider extracting them to a secure location. No, I said after a moment's consideration. That would alert these people that we're onto their surveillance network. For now, let's keep our knowledge hidden while implementing protection measures that aren't easily detected. James nodded. Approvingly. Good strategy. I've arranged for a neighbor, a retired police detective who owes me a favor, to move into the guest house on your parents' property. He'll maintain discreet surveillance coverage without alerting the monitoring team. As James set up the secure equipment, I outlined the plan I'd formulated overnight. We're shifting from defensive to offensive operations. Based on intelligence we've gathered, Richard wasn't just stealing for personal gain. He was operating a systematic bribery scheme across multiple development projects using funds from these criminal investment sources. That significantly escalates the situation, James noted, his expression grave. These organizations won't just be concerned about recovering specific funds. They'll be worried about exposure of their entire operational structure. Exactly. Which gives us potential leverage. I need to establish direct communication with decision-makers at Kingsley Investments. Not the frontline enforcers watching my movements, but whoever actually controls their operations. James studied me carefully. That's exceptionally dangerous territory, Elise. These aren't people who respond well to threats or perceived manipulation. I'm not planning to threaten them. I'm planning to offer a business proposition, one that protects my interests while addressing their primary concerns. After outlining the specifics of my approach, I contacted Victor to implement the technological aspects of the plan. By midday, we had assembled the necessary documentation and established secure channels for the communication I intended to initiate. The next step required careful coordination with Mira and Detective Wilson. In a joint meeting at the Federal Building's secure conference room, I presented my strategy to both of them simultaneously. This is significantly outside standard procedure. Detective Wilson objected after hearing my proposal. We don't facilitate civilian negotiations with criminal organizations, regardless of the potential intelligence value. I understand your position, I replied calmly, but we're facing extraordinary circumstances that conventional approaches can't adequately address. These entities have demonstrated both the resources and the determination to pursue their objectives, regardless of legal boundaries. Traditional protection measures are stopgaps at best. Mira, always the pragmatist, saw the practical merits more clearly. From a legal standpoint, what Elise is suggesting doesn't actually violate any laws. She's not proposing to conceal evidence or obstruct justice, merely to negotiate terms that would ensure her personal safety while potentially providing valuable intelligence about these organizations' operations. After extended discussion, we reached a compromise. The FBI task force would maintain official distance from my negotiation attempts, but would monitor all communications and stand ready to intervene if the situation escalated toward imminent danger. In exchange, I agreed to share all information obtained through these channels with the investigation. With this framework established, I initiated the first phase of my plan, a carefully crafted message directed to the actual controllers of Kingsley Investments, bypassing their frontline operators. Victor had identified several secure email addresses associated with the organization's upper management structure, hidden behind layers of digital protection but nonetheless accessible. Through his specialized resources, my message was concise and carefully calibrated. To Kingsley Management, I possess comprehensive documentation regarding the actual disposition of your $28 million investment in the Boston Commons Development Project, including the $11 million diverted from the project through shell companies in Cyprus, Malta, and the Seychelles. This documentation details the ultimate recipients of these funds, including specific regulatory officials and their intermediaries. I am not interested in exposing this information. I am interested in a mutually beneficial resolution that addresses your legitimate financial concerns while ensuring my complete separation from this situation. Richard Chen acted independently and without my knowledge. I am not a party to his activities or current location. However, I control information that affects your broader operational interests beyond this specific project. I propose a direct discussion with appropriate decision-makers to establish terms that would remove me entirely from your concerns while protecting certain financial interests you may wish to keep confidential. A secure communication channel has been established at encrypted contact details. This channel will remain open for 24 hours. Elise Chen. The message was deliberately calibrated to demonstrate knowledge without appearing threatening, presenting myself as a potential business partner rather than an adversary or victim. After Victor verified the communication had been delivered through channels that would bypass lower-level operators, we waited. The response came just 4 hours later, arriving through the secure channel we'd established. Mrs. Chen, your message has been received by appropriate parties. Verification of your claim documentation is required before further discussion. Provide sample evidence demonstrating specific knowledge of transactions beyond publicly available information. Kingsley Management. This was the critical juncture, providing enough information to establish credibility without surrendering key leverage. After consultation with Victor, I selected 3 specific transactions from the evidence we'd assembled. A payment to a shell company ultimately linked to a senior zoning official, a series of transfers that connected Kingsley funds to a state regulatory board member, and documentation showing the specific routing of funds through 5 separate jurisdictions to obscure their origins. I transmitted this limited evidence with a simple message: sample documentation attached, comprehensive materials secured with appropriate fail-safes, available for discussion of mutually agreeable terms. The next response came remarkably quickly, within 30 minutes. Secure video conference, 2 hours. Access details to follow. James immediately enhanced security measures around the safe house, while Victor implemented additional protections for the upcoming video call. They'll attempt to trace the connection, he warned. We've established adequate countermeasures, but remain aware that they're gathering intelligence throughout this interaction. As the appointed time approached, I prepared myself mentally for perhaps the most consequential negotiation of my life. My professional background had trained me for high-stakes financial discussions, but nothing in my experience had prepared me for negotiating with criminal organizations over my own safety. The video connection established precisely on schedule. The screen showed a well-appointed office with 2 individuals, a silver-haired man in his 60s wearing an impeccably tailored suit, and a younger woman with sharp features and calculating eyes, dressed with similar sophistication. Neither offered names, though the man spoke with a slight Eastern European accent. Mrs. Chen, this is an unusual situation, he began without preamble. You've presented information of a sensitive nature while suggesting a business discussion. We're interested in understanding exactly what you propose. I maintained a composed, professional demeanor despite my racing heart. My proposal is straightforward. I seek complete disengagement from any matters involving your organization, Richard Chen, or the Boston Commons Project. In exchange, I'm prepared to provide comprehensive documentation regarding the actual disposition of your investment funds, information that would allow you to pursue recovery through more productive channels than focusing on me. And why would this information not already be in the possession of authorities? The woman asked, her tone precisely balanced between skepticism and interest. Because I've exercised discretion while protecting my own interests. The documentation I possess has been secured for my personal protection, not for law enforcement purposes. My goal is resolution, not escalation. The silver-haired man leaned forward slightly. You must understand our concern that once such an arrangement was completed, nothing would prevent you from subsequently sharing this information with authorities. I anticipate that concern, I replied calmly, which is why I propose a structured arrangement with mutual assurances. I have no personal interest in your broader business operations. My sole objective is to extricate myself from this situation and resume my life without looking over my shoulder. That outcome is entirely compatible with your interests in resolving the specific issue of the misappropriated funds. The two conferred briefly in whispered tones before the man addressed me again. You appear to be an intelligent woman who understands practical realities. We appreciate that approach. However, the situation with Richard Chen involves significant financial losses beyond what your documentation might address. His actions have created complications extending beyond mere monetary considerations. I'm aware of the amounts involved, I countered. Approximately $11 million diverted from the Boston Commons project, with similar patterns potentially evident in previous development projects. However, pursuing me offers no pathway to recovering those funds, while the documentation I possess identifies the actual recipients of much of that money, entities you might have more productive recourse with. And what of Richard Chen himself? Do you maintain contact? Have knowledge of his current location or activities? I've had one communication since his departure, an email warning me to stop interfering with the Cayman accounts. I have no knowledge of his current location, nor any loyalty to a man who betrayed me as thoroughly as he apparently betrayed your organization. Another private conference between the two, longer this time, with occasional glances toward the camera. Finally, the woman spoke. We propose the following terms. You will provide complete documentation regarding the diverted funds, including all recipient entities, account details, and transaction records. In exchange, we will consider your personal involvement in this. Matter concluded, with no further interest in you or your activities. Additionally, we require your assistance in unfreezing the Cayman accounts currently subject to banking restrictions, as those funds represent a small but significant portion of our broader financial interests. I can agree to providing the documentation, I responded carefully. However, the Cayman accounts contain my personal marital assets stolen by Richard Chen, funds entirely separate from your investment in the Boston Commons project. I'm willing to facilitate access to any funds in those accounts that can be verified as originating from your organization, but not to personal assets to which I have legitimate claim. The negotiation continued for nearly an hour, addressing specific details of the proposed arrangement. Throughout, I maintained a delicate balance, firm in protecting my core interests while demonstrating flexibility on peripheral matters. My training in high-stakes financial negotiations served me well, allowing me to project confidence despite the extraordinary circumstances. Eventually, we reached tentative agreement on key terms. I would provide comprehensive documentation on the diverted funds and their recipients. Kingsley would cease all surveillance and interest in me personally. The Cayman accounts would be divided based on verified source documentation, with my marital assets returned to me and any funds traced to Kingsley Investments released to their control. One final matter, the silver-haired man said as our discussion concluded. Richard Chen. Should he contact you, or should you discover information regarding his whereabouts or activities, what would be your intended course of action? The question carried obvious implications. They wanted to know if I would protect Richard or alert authorities if I learned of his location. My answer would reveal much about my character and reliability from their perspective. Richard Chen. Destroyed my life as I knew it, I replied with genuine emotion. He stole my money, betrayed my trust, and left me to deal with dangerous situations he created. I have no loyalty to him and no interest in his future beyond the legal proceedings, already in motion for divorce and financial recovery. Should he contact me, my response would depend entirely on my own interests at that moment, not on any residual loyalty to a man who deserves none. The woman nodded, seemingly satisfied with this honest assessment. We understand each other. Mrs. Chen, final terms will be transmitted through this secure channel within 24 hours. Until then, maintain your current security posture and make no additional legal or financial movements regarding the matters we've discussed. The connection ended abruptly, leaving me in the suddenly silent room with James and Victor. For several moments, none of us spoke, processing the extraordinary interaction that had just occurred. They're going to verify everything you've told them before finalizing any agreement, James finally said. Expect increased surveillance for the next 24 hours as they confirm details. Victor nodded in agreement. The negotiation went as well, as could be expected. They appeared genuinely interested in a pragmatic resolution rather than continued conflict. That's consistent with how these organizations typically operate. Financial interests ultimately outweigh punitive considerations. The next day passed in tense anticipation. As James had predicted, our security monitoring detected increased surveillance activity around all my known locations and associates. Through secure channels, Victor confirmed that detailed investigation of the documentation samples I'd provided was underway, with specific transactions being verified through Kingsley's own financial networks. Detective Wilson maintained regular contact, clearly uncomfortable with the unauthorized negotiation, but professionally focused on the potential intelligence value. If this proceeds as discussed, the documentation you provide will give us unprecedented insight into both the bribery network and the financial structure of this organization. That's valuable regardless of the specific resolution of your personal situation. Exactly 24 hours after our video conference, the promised communication arrived through the secure channel, a detailed agreement outlining the terms we'd discussed, with specific procedures for implementation. The document reflected professional legal drafting, though obviously crafted to avoid any explicitly incriminating language. After review with both Victor and Mira, I determined the terms adequately protected my interests while providing a clear path toward resolution. Within hours, I had initiated the first phase of the agreement, transferring the complete documentation regarding the diverted funds through the secure channel, while retaining copies for potential future leverage. The response was swift and businesslike: confirmation of receipt, verification procedures underway, and instructions for the next phase involving the Cayman accounts. Ms. Foster at the bank received official documentation withdrawing the disputed claims, allowing the accounts to be unfrozen and the funds divided according to source verification. 3 days later, James reported a significant development. All surveillance teams have been withdrawn. Monitoring of your parents' home in San Francisco, your office, Mira's office, and all other identified locations has ceased. They appear to be honoring the agreement. This assessment was confirmed when Detective Wilson called with her own update. We've been tracking known associates of the Kingsley organization. There's been a clear operational shift away from you toward several regulatory officials and financial intermediaries identified in the documentation you provided. They're pursuing recovery through those channels now. 1 week after the initial negotiation, I received final confirmation of the account division in the Caymans. My marital assets, the $425,000 Richard had transferred from our joint accounts, were being returned to my control, while funds verified as originating from Kingsley Investments had been released to their designated accounts. The resolution had proceeded with remarkable efficiency, reflecting the fundamentally transactional nature of these criminal organizations. Once they determined that pursuing me offered less financial benefit than following the evidence trail to the actual recipients of their diverted funds, they adjusted their operations accordingly. As the immediate danger receded, I began the process of reclaiming some semblance of normal life. The high-security safe house was no longer necessary, though James recommended maintaining enhanced personal security measures indefinitely. Organizations like Kingsley have long memories, he cautioned. The agreement appears to be holding, but prudent precautions remain advisable. I returned to my Cambridge apartment, now equipped with significantly upgraded security features, and gradually resumed my professional responsibilities at the investment firm. Eleanor welcomed me back with characteristic directness. Whatever storm you've been weathering seems to have passed. Your clients will be relieved. Several were concerned when they were temporarily reassigned. The divorce proceedings continued, though Richard's continued absence simplified certain aspects while complicating others. Mira filed for divorce on grounds of abandonment and financial misconduct, with the court ultimately granting an uncontested judgment in my favor given Richard's failure to respond to any legal notices. Financial resolution proved more complex as Richard's business affairs continued unraveling with mounting evidence of widespread fraud and misappropriation. Multiple investor lawsuits emerged, each seeking recovery from increasingly depleted assets. Mira successfully protected my recovered funds and personal property, establishing clear separation from Richard's business liabilities. Through careful legal maneuvering, I was able to sell our suburban home, using the proceeds to establish a new financial foundation entirely separate from anything connected to Richard. The Cambridge apartment, the one asset he'd never known about, became my primary residence, symbolizing the independent life I was reconstructing. 3 months after Richard's initial disappearance, I received a plain envelope at my office containing only a newspaper clipping from a small Caribbean island newspaper. The brief article reported an unidentified male body discovered on a remote beach, apparent victim of a boating accident, with investigation ongoing. No note accompanied the clipping, nor any indication of who had sent it. I never received definitive confirmation of Richard's fate, though the implication seemed clear enough. Whether Kingsley's organization had eventually located him, or whether other creditors or criminal associates had caught up with him first, remained unknown. In a way, the uncertainty provided cleaner closure. I needed neither to mourn nor to feel responsible for whatever end he had met. His choices had set him on that path long before I discovered his betrayal. My offshore fortune, the financial independence my grandmother had insisted upon, had provided the foundation for everything that followed. Without those resources, I would have been truly vulnerable when Richard drained our joint accounts. Without that financial security, I might have been forced to accept lesser terms or dangerous compromises in resolving the situation Richard had created. 1 year after the events that had so dramatically altered my life, I established the Chen Financial Independence Foundation, a nonprofit organization providing both educational resources and direct assistance to women seeking to establish financial security independent of their partners. The foundation emphasized practical strategies for maintaining separate assets, recognizing financial red flags in relationships, and navigating complex financial situations during relationship transitions. The work became unexpectedly fulfilling. Purpose emerging from pain, creating meaning from what could have remained merely trauma. Each woman who established her own financial security through the foundation's guidance represented a small victory against the vulnerability I had so narrowly avoided. My grandmother's wisdom had ultimately protected me from forces she could never have specifically anticipated. Her insistence on maintaining separate financial identity within marriage, a principle I had once considered unnecessarily paranoid, had proven prophetic in ways neither of us could have imagined. The offshore fortune Richard never knew about had saved me not just financially, but perhaps literally, providing the resources and leverage necessary to extricate myself from the dangerous web of criminal financial entanglements he had created. More importantly, it had preserved my agency and independence during a crisis that might otherwise have left me powerless. On my grandmother's birth anniversary, I visited her grave with a simple bouquet of her favorite peonies. Standing before the elegant headstone, I felt profound gratitude for the woman whose foresight had altered the course of my life. "You were right," I said softly to the quiet cemetery surroundings. "Not just about the money, but about maintaining independence even within partnership. I didn't fully understand then, but I do now." The foundation I'd established in her honor would extend that wisdom to other women, creating a legacy of financial empowerment that transcended my personal experience. From the devastating betrayal that had nearly destroyed me had emerged a deeper understanding of both financial and personal resilience. Richard had drained our accounts before leaving, believing he was stripping me of both resources and options. What he hadn't known, what he had never bothered to truly understand about the woman he'd married, was that my greatest assets weren't in those joint accounts. They resided in the independent financial identity I had maintained despite his subtle discouragement, in the professional expertise he had often dismissed, and in the resilience he had severely underestimated. The offshore fortune he never discovered had given me the means to fight back, but the determination to rebuild rather than merely survive, that had come from within, from the woman my grandmother had raised me to be, the woman who emerged stronger from betrayal rather than being defined by it. As I left the cemetery that day, I felt a sense of completion, not because the trauma had disappeared, but because it had been transformed into something meaningful. Richard's betrayal had intended to diminish me, to leave me broken and destitute. Instead, it had revealed strengths I hadn't known I possessed and purpose I might never otherwise have discovered. The money he hadn't known about had provided immediate protection. But the woman he had never truly seen, resourceful, determined, and ultimately unbroken, she was the real fortune he had failed to recognize until it was far too late. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.